folks on the line who haven't joined us before, welcome to our May Journal Club. Journal clubs are one of the favorite events on the Dime calendar. We always bring a smaller group together, and it's such a wonderful opportunity to get together with an author of a manuscript that is important to our field at this current time and really sort of have a conversation with them. And today I'm delighted to welcome Anzar Abbas to talk about his manuscript, Digital Measurement of Mental Health, Challenges, Promises, and Future Directions. So as I said, I do want to make sure that everyone on the line knows how we can use this session as an interactive conversation with Anzar. So before we dive in, let's do just a little bit of housekeeping. So full disclosure, we'll always let you know, we are recording today's session, so keep that in mind during the conversation. This will be posted, the recording will be posted to the website likely tomorrow, so this will be a resource that's available to colleagues after the fact too. We run our journal clubs very much as a Ask Me Anything or as a discussion forum. So Anzar is going to kick us off in just a second with some behind the scenes look at the work that went into generating the paper, and from the author's perspective, what are the implications of sort of the findings and calls to action here. We do really try and encourage an interactive discussion. So please feel free to raise your hand, not like this, but using the participant list. If you're in a place where you can, we'll unmute you and have you sort of join the conversation properly. In addition, if you're somewhere where you can't talk, you can feel free to pop your question into the chat or into the Q&A function. But we will spend most of our time together in discussion. So without further ado, hopefully now everyone's been sort of oriented to the session and how we'll run it. Anzar, I'm absolutely delighted to have you here today. I so enjoyed this manuscript. I think it's a really important piece of scholarship. And with that, let me hand over to you. I'd love for you to introduce yourself to folks on the line, tell them a little bit about your background, and then let's dive into some thoughts and remarks from your side on the manuscript.
Yeah, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Michelle, for both of you guys to put the event together, and everybody for attending. My name is Anzar. I'm a neuroscientist by background. My research was on development of pattern finding algorithms for large brain activity data sets. I joined AICure a little over a couple of years ago to essentially help build out their digital phenotyping platform. And in that work, we've developed a tool that can look at facial and vocal characteristics using smartphone-based assessments and use those measurements in clinical research, et cetera. Actually, Friday was my last day at AICure. I'll be starting a new job in a couple of weeks. So I'm on vacation in Mexico right now. So very happy to be talking to you guys. Yeah, very happy to be here. So kind of how the paper came about was Katerina, who's one of the co-authors, is a professor in emergency medicine at Columbia. And she brought up to Isaac and myself, Isaac's also one of the co-authors, that they were looking for a nice review on digital phenotyping and if we were interested in writing the paper. At the time, Isaac and I were sort of knee-deep in figuring out sort of the product strategy and understanding the technology that we wanted to build and were developing and trying to make successful. And so we had a lot of thoughts sort of ruminating on the field and where our tech fit into it and what the vision could be for such technology in the future. So I thought it would be really good exercise to sort of put those thoughts down on paper, especially because there isn't much of a sort of a common vision in terms of what digital phenotyping and digital measurement could look like. I think these kind of perspectives are emerging, so papers like these are important for us to put our thoughts down and communicate them. For example, this paper is very similar to some others. Andy has a paper in Nature Digital Medicine in which she talks about fairly broadly about digital biomarkers, tries to define them and also classifies them, but in a very different way. And I think all these papers are fairly complementary to each other at this stage of the field when we're trying to figure out what the direction we're all going towards is in. The structure of the paper is fairly similar. I just kind of first talk about the need for such tools. I try to classify them in my own sort of imperfect way. And one of the reasons I'm excited for today's event is I'd love to hear everybody's feedback on what they think of that kind of classification. I wanted to talk about individual challenges for each of those measurement tools. There was not enough of a word limit. I wasn't even allowed like more than 30 references or something for this journal. But I do speak to some common challenges and then try to sort of paint a picture of perhaps an optimistic vision for how this tech could come out. So any questions so far? And if not, then I'll kind of just dive into what I quickly go over and summarize the paper and then open it up for questions. Okay, so I was thinking earlier today about how to sort of get into the paper, because this is a little bit preaching to the choir in terms of the need for measurement tools and why digital measurement is important. But I think in mental health, it's particularly a necessity right now, because generally speaking in healthcare, there's just, if I go to the doctor and I have an infection, they can run labs. If I go to the doctor and if I've broken a bone, they can run an X-ray. If I go to the doctor and I have arrhythmias, they can run an EKG. So in that aspect, they have tools available to them to quantify my health. But if I'm depressed, there's really no equivalent or objective measurement tools. There's no such thing as a blood test for depression. They rely on subjective observation or sort of paper pencil assessments. And there really hasn't been much progress in psychiatry and neurology in terms of how to measure mental health in decades. And these tools are going to be really critical because, in my perspective, they can provide a really clear pathway to objective measurements if we can build the technology the right way. So the classification sort of strategy that we use was fairly intentional in this paper, because there's a lot of ways to classify all the tech that's emerging. It can be by the type of device that's used, if it's a consumer one or sort of medical grade one. It can be the kind of sensor that was utilized or what kind of algorithms it relies on. But I feel the one that we've done in this paper, we try to focus on the manner in which the data is collected. And the reason we did that is it's much more centric to the patient's experience of the technology and how they interact with it and how the data is collected from the patient. So Jen, if you go to the next slide, the sort of the four main categories that we try to sort of put these measurement tools in is passive monitoring. So sort of wearables or pedometers or sort of activity monitors that can in the background be collecting information, or even things like sort of electronic behavior similar to the keystroke activity or social media activity that is passively sort of can be looked at without the patient having to actively do something to provide a specific assessment. Then we sort of look at more active assessments. So those would be similar to what we were building at AI Cure, aspects of facial expressivity or voice and speech or movement or cognitive assessments that the patient would have to actually say, all right, this is the time and place for me to now do this thing. And that's going to provide whoever's recording the data set that they need to make those measurements. Then there was individual self-report. And I have a soft spot in my heart for self-report because it's in a future where we're going to be integrating different measurements into sort of a unified place to try and have a more nuanced understanding of patient health and behavior. Self-report is very important because it doesn't matter what any other tool or measurement technology is saying. If the patient's not having a better experience from their own perspective, then nothing else really matters. So in that future, I think this data set will be very important. So I wanted to include it in here. And also a very intentional decision to include these sort of like quote unquote biological measurements, which are much more traditional technologies like neuroimaging or genetics, or health records, to be part of the classification, because those two contain vast amounts of really important data that is indicative of health and behavior. So, even though something like an fMRI scan or genetic sequencing maybe not on the forefront of like these discussions on new technologies for digital phenotyping, I think that they're just as important, if not to be considering on how to integrate those data sets into a sort of a unified architecture. In terms of the challenges, we kind of discussed a little bit of the challenges in terms of how can there be a way for us to trust the measurements that come out of this? And that's really the discussion around validation. There's ambiguity at times, most times, in the regulation of such technologies and how we can sort of check some boxes to be able to put them in the context that we want them to be used. There's questions around application of, there's an existing way in which healthcare works, and we have to be considerate of those processes when we're developing the tech so that we can build it in a way where it's not causing a lot of friction. Because a doctor has what, like 15 minutes per patient, and I'm not going to ask them to like close out of Epic or Cerner and go to this other app, and like you know, it's just, we have to think about how to integrate with existing systems within the healthcare sort of ecosystem. And then finally, I try to chart out sort of an idyllic vision of what these technologies can accomplish. And this is the part that I'm actually really excited to discuss with everyone, because at the end of the day, if you go to the next slide, Jen, all of these are individual measurement tools, and they can be successful in their own pockets within clinical research or within patient care. But I think the real sort of promise of them is their integration to make higher level judgments. So if a doctor's sitting down with a patient to assess their health, they're not just going to like close their eyes and listen to their voice. They're not just going to like look at their records and not ask them any questions. They're not just going to like, I don't know, observe their step count or look at their labs. They're trying to make actionable judgments from several kinds of multimodal data sets. And though our tools that we've developed are good right now at individual measurements or classifying specific symptoms, we are not yet in a place where we can unify those disparate measurements into single actionable insights. And I think there's sort of agreement amongst the field that's the direction that we want to go in. And the challenges of that are really sort of quite robust right now. You know, like we have to think about what kind of technological infrastructure we need to even be able to integrate those tools. We need to think about how to, if we're going to be sort of transferring information from one place to the other and trying to integrate measurements, how do we even consider privacy and regulation in that aspect when considering HIPAA or GDPR? How do we think about those kinds of problems and sort of who the players would be and where that data set would reside and how that would interact with the doctor and the patient are all really important questions to be considering right now. And so this paper sort of tries to chart that vision, address, sort of highlight those challenges. And at the time, it was really useful for myself and Isaac to sit down and write, because it helped us kind of think more broadly about the field that we were working in and what direction we're all heading in. And so the vision really is that we can put something like a cognitive assessment tool or a blood pressure monitor or activity measurement. These are all separate devices, separate tools, maybe even developed by separate companies, and they all have their own sort of cloud infrastructure where they're storing that securely. But if there were these dotted arrows to try and transfer data between those different measurements into one sort of big place, like the blue cloud over there, from there, we can now run sort of higher level machine learning models that can look at individual symptoms of a disease and try to make sort of one judgment on severity or response to treatment or prediction on rehospitalization or something like that. Maybe that prediction can then be outputted to an interface that is compatible with the way a clinician is sort of operating, and they can then make their decisions with the assistance of that information that they in the past may not have had access to. So yeah, thanks so much for listening. Happy to open up for questions and very excited for the discussion.
Fantastic, Anzar. Thank you so much for taking us through the sort of the manuscript from your side. So just a refresher for folks and also a quick note for folks who dialed in a couple minutes after the hour. We do really run our journal clubs as discussion forums. So if you are somewhere where you can turn your video on, please feel comfortable doing so. It makes for a much more participatory conversation. Also, I've got a few questions for you, Anzar, and I'm going to use moderators' sort of liberties here to get us going. but do welcome folks to pop some questions in the chat or raise your hand and pose them directly, and we will drive towards a sort of conversation for the rest of our time together. Anzar, I really liked how you thought about the categorization of this, and I was particularly taken with the fact you focused in mental health. You opened with some really thoughtful remarks around, it's comparatively easy to think about getting a blood draw, for example, to diagnose some conditions, but mental health sort of challenges are much more complex. You mention in the manuscript in your title, as you look at sort of the path ahead, about this idea of digital phenotyping. And I wonder if you could sort of take us through your vision there. For me, I'm excited about it. You think of these incredibly sort of broad conditions like major depressive disorder, and we know that that manifests very differently for different people. We know that there are different sort of subpopulations of responders to a variety of different treatment approaches, and I think about how much better we could care for these patients if we could get this sort of digital phenotyping right. So welcome your thoughts on that, if you wouldn't mind sharing them.
I think that's a really important point, because, and one thing I want to mention there is the classifications of the disorders that we have are entirely arbitrarily man-made. Like, we define bipolar disorder and depression as two different things, but the brain doesn't know that, and I think the nosology in which these classifications are grounded in is somewhat outdated, and we know that at this point. They're very helpful to have these classifications of diseases, but in reality, what's really going on is there's pathways that are disrupted, there's clusters of cells that are affected or damaged, and that's causing an effect in overall symptomatology and behavior, and then clinicians will try to classify that from there. But I think having digital phenotyping of individual behaviors and health and functioning can allow for a more nuanced measurement of what's going wrong, which is very important because it directly addresses the great amount of nuance that's needed to try and understand what's wrong with the patient. So I think it's really critical that we can, in the future, be in a place where we're not so reliant on these sort of classifications of diseases, but can understand with greater complexity the individual pathways that are disrupted and how those may be affecting patient health and behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And as I think about the pathway to sort of realizing that vision, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat here to make sure I'm not missing anyone. As we think about the pathway sort of forward for that vision, you mentioned a variety of different challenges, right? You mentioned sort of building a sort of body of evidence around the individual measure, such that not only do we sort of trust that it is correctly measuring what it says it is, but that we actually understand that in context, that as we see variability in that measure, we understand the clinical implications. And that's one piece, but you go further in this piece than a lot of sort of other publications or sort of other thinking to say that this individual measure in isolation may not itself be enough, but rather we have to put it into a more traditional clinical context. We have to have this sort of rich tapestry of information about the individual in front of us. And then, that then becomes part of the integration challenges, right? The infrastructure. Where do we start, right? Instead of sitting back and feeling overwhelmed, by the magnitude of what needs to happen to realize this vision, what's the right place to start?
I think that's a really important question that we should all be asking right now rather than later, because similar to, if you're in the early stages of a company or you think about a product, it's good to think about the scalability right from the get-go. Similarly, we have to think about what I call sort of a common technological infrastructure. Is these disparate measurement tools, how could they potentially come into the same place? And it's actually not an unsolved problem, considering the availability of cloud-based platforms that we're all going to rely on as we're building tech. It's actually a huge advantage that nobody's using their own servers, nobody's using their own sort of storage. We're all putting them on GCP, AWS, whatever it may be. And those guys, they know what they're doing. They're building these cloud-based platforms that allow for integration of different data sets. They're building them that allow for us to do that while staying HIPAA compliant. And dealing with PHI. I think the perspective that individual developers need to then have has to take that into consideration in that I don't want my measurement to be isolated from others, because it's actually at a disadvantage to myself and others when I do that. And that's a challenge, not just in people's perspective, but also technologically. You have to assign resources to building APIs that will allow for transfer of that information. You have to think about what are the business partnerships and the pricing models upon which you're going to share that information with other people. So let's say tomorrow there's a measurement of schizophrenia that's being developed. Schizophrenia, I'm not an expert on this, but they've got some sort of negative symptoms, let's say, of facial and vocal behavior that we were measuring at AICure. In addition to that, there's another company that measures their actigraphy. There's another company that measures cognitive assessments, right? And let's say that the company that measures, I'm going to pick arbitrary cognitive assessments, is the one that is responsible for giving the final input to the physician or the clinical trial, whatever it may be. Then the other two measurements of actigraphy and facial vocal behavior need to share that information with that person. And that's a very different business model than sharing that information directly with the healthcare provider or the pharma company. And when those different measurements are disparate, it's more difficult to sort of train a higher level model on overall schizophrenia severity, rather than looking at individual symptoms. So we kind of have to come to terms with the fact that there's going to be one person that gets to build that model, and that may not be me. But I can be an important feature in that model if I can provide my measurement to that other third party. And that's a difficult thing to sort of people to grasp, because they want to be the one that provides the ultimate measure. They don't want to be the individual measurement tool. They want to be the sort of the higher up in the hierarchy. And on top of that, the players are very different. There's a lot of different skill sets and advantages and disadvantages to working in tech, to working within academia, to working out of healthcare, and the motivations are all very different. Your question around validation and sort of building evidence towards technologies, academia is for the most part fairly comfortable with sharing their methodology and publishing their code and talking about it very openly. Maybe a private company is not. Maybe they want to just sort of keep some parts of it proprietary and limited, but are happy to share other aspects of the development. But the difference with them is they're going to have really advanced and professional sort of software development processes, which a academic group will not. And when you're facing sort of a regulatory review, you're going to need both openness and rigor in your development procedures. So how do then those two things come together? So I think the challenge of integration is really important for us to think about right now, because we need to be building our tech in a way that the measurements that we come up with don't end up isolated, because they're not going to be useful when they're isolated. I don't care if I can only measure the acoustic properties or the speech of somebody that has Alzheimer's. That's on its own not a very informative measure, but when it's put together with other aspects of their functioning, only then does it become an actionable insight that somebody can use. So, and there's not going to be one group of people that can provide all of the measurements. There just isn't. So we have to learn how to work together to be able to integrate whatever it is that we're coming up with into a unified place. And from there can higher level judgments be made.
It's so interesting, and it sort of leads me to the need, as you said, for thinking not only about the right business models here, as you sort of described, but also that sort of cultural shift to really think about what's my product, what's my tool, what's my organization going to contribute to this, and who needs to be at my side, who needs to be my partners to get me there. Jessica, I'm not sure if you're somewhere where you can speak, but I think about the sort of tools that I know that you're working on, they sort of are very aligned with some of the examples that Anzar was just sharing. If you're somewhere you can sort of join in the conversation and you're willing, I'd love to learn from you about how you think about placing the tools you build not only as sort of valuable in and of themselves, but as part of this larger tapestry. Is that something you think about with the Winterlight Labs team?
Hi, thanks, Jen. Yeah, we think about this actually in a really similar way. So Winterlight builds specifically speech analysis tools for clinical research and clinical care. And we sort of had a reckoning as a company where we were like, okay, we think, much like Anzar said, multimodal things are the answer. Speech is really valuable. It's maybe being missed in a lot of clinical tools right now, but we don't think it's going to replace everything. You're not going to throw out all your existing assessments and all your existing tools and only use speech. And so currently as a company, our position was kind of, let's be really, really good at one thing. Let's be the speech people. And we sort of had to decide, are we also going to start doing eye tracking? Are we also going to start doing these other sensors? And so, yeah, I think we're also thinking of this in a similar way where we want to build the speech tool, but we're really open to collaboration with other groups who are building the eye tracking tools, who are building the actigraphy, et cetera, and ultimately we do think these multimodal ways of tracking are going to be the ones that are capturing the bigger picture and able to kind of leverage all the different technologies that different groups are specializing in and different groups are developing, and then that will hopefully get us further. So I think pretty aligned in that way.
And Jessica, I want to commend you. I've kind of noticed Winterlight's been doing that, and that's really nice. To get a little bit more tangible, like how do you think that will manifest itself, like in terms of SDKs or APIs that other people can use or rely on? And then who would be the recipient of the data insights that you come up with? Would it be the pharma company? Would it be another measurement tool? Would it be some other party?
Yeah, those are great questions. Full disclosure, I'm on the science team, not the business team. So these are not questions I spend all my day thinking about. But yeah, we are thinking more about, we have our own app and we have our own analysis infrastructure, but we are kind of moving into a space where we might be using more API kind of style technology so that it can be integrated into other platforms and other apps. And I think the question about who's receiving it is a good one. I don't know necessarily off the top of my head. I think right now we're sort of at the stage where we're starting to partner with other companies and starting to integrate different assessments together. But yeah, what's the end game of that? I don't know how high up that's going to go, how many integrations happen before we have an end product. I think that's something that's still very much in development, at least on our side.
And I think Jessica brings up a really good point, which is this is not just about the science. It is absolutely about the business model. It is absolutely about the partnerships. It's absolutely about how we price this and how we make sure that all the stakeholders are benefiting from these kinds of arrangements. And those are challenges just as significant as the models that we're building on their own. Because it doesn't matter how accurately I can predict depression, if I can't figure out how that benefits everybody that's involved in the effort, then it's not really going to get into the hands of patients. And we have to think about that kind of stuff.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just to build on that a little bit, to think about the receiving end, of course, is the patient, but the one who are going to be using those tools are the physicians, the clinicians, to diagnose the patient or determine the severity of the disorder. So you want to think of also about the economic model there, like the compensation. And so is that going to be a very expensive tool that the adoption of that in the real world, like in the practice world, will be really little? Or so it's stuff. I know I'm also not in the business, but just to think about those things. These are tools are really, really, and I do agree with you, because the human body is not just like organs that are functioning discretely, separately. That we're all connected, and so bringing different the genotype, the phenotype, the digital phenotype into the mix, it will definitely help diagnose or better the disorder or disease in question.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Reem, because it's actually something that we don't discuss in the paper and is a whole different discussion, which is the difference that is involved in developing this tech for clinical trials, which a lot of us work in, versus population and patient health, because, and that has a direct impact on how much it costs, because per patient, the margins are just significantly higher in clinical trials than they are in population health. So for it to be economically feasible to build this tech for pop health, the developer needs to think about deploying it in a lot larger populations at a much larger scale in pop health, because the margins are a lot slimmer. And if you're going to do that, then you have to build tech that's going to be significantly more complicated and much more flexible than it needs to be for a clinical trial. Clinical trials are rigid, they don't change much. The schedule is predefined. And in actual real patient care, it's very, very different, and the tech needs to be built according to that. It's harder.
True. But you have to think about it that this is, a clinical, when you're running a clinical trial, you're testing the effectiveness and the safety of your intervention. And who's going to, the idea is to bring it to the healthcare. So it'll be in the practice. So now, if that tool has been developed in the space of clinical trial for the participants, how applicable that is going to be in practice. It has to go with it. It's a sort of a companion tool. It's like, okay, if you want to treat this way, you have to actually, your patient has to meet those measures, be diagnosed based on those tools. So those tools will carry over from the clinical trial into the practice. So it's not that it's going to end there. And I think that's, you want to also think about the cost that those, partnerships are going to be. Are you going to, think about the adoption. Is that going to increase the cost? And in the US is very expensive. And we know as those digital tools are coming out really very valuable, but how they're going to be adopted in practice. I think just to think about the cost that also will come with it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's why one of the points that I want to make is right now, it's not just about the science and the model building. The entire structure of the company needs to think about these problems. The product team needs to be, I think the difference between a good versus a great product team in our industry right now is domain expertise within the teams. And same goes with commercial teams, the business development teams, and marketing teams, for them to really understand that the scientific solution is not the end of the problem. We have to think about what this tech looks like, how it's going to be used, who the users are going to be, how it interacts with the patient, how we can ensure that people actually use and participate in the provision of data to the recipients, which is a whole different problem on its own. And it will require not just scientific expertise and clinical expertise, but also expertise from product teams and business development teams to think through those problems of integration.
I want to riff a little bit off Reem's comment, which I think is really good. And this is a fantastic conversation, everyone. I do like the idea in terms of sort of value of being eyes wide open to the opportunity to take a really powerful sort of digital assessment tool in the clinical trial sort of ecosystem, which Anzar, you're exactly right. I mean, there's so much work that goes into this, the activation energy you have to overcome to get to a point where these sort of tools are not only sort of validated, but that there's sort of a level of trust in them. We have enough sort of experience with, how they are perceived by the population of interest, the sort of operationalization of not only the tool itself, but sort of the data they generate, so on and so forth. The opportunity to take, where appropriate, those measures and sort of pull them into the post-market as a potential companion product does seem like a pathway that could offer a lot of value, so that they, as well as sort of assessing performance and maybe even sort of doing some enrichment or identifying subpopulations within a clinical trial, could actually go out and be an important sort of companion product in the post market. And Anzar, are you aware of any other sort of organizations that are either actively doing this, that are thinking about this at the current time, that have this sort of longer term approach mapped out over time?
I think that, so yes, there definitely are people out there that are trying to make this happen. We actually submitted a grant ourselves with NYU Langone in Brooklyn, their psychiatry outpatient clinic, to integrate facial vocal measurements into treatment of patients with schizophrenia. Because they have sort of a spectrum of risk amongst their patients. There's like those super high risk ones that are coming into the clinic like 200 times a year, which is, we can't deal with those. They have like actively people working on addressing those manually. And then there's patients that they're not that worried about in terms of risk of rehospitalization and treatment failure, but there's this big like middle group of patients that they would love to have some insight into their behavior between clinic appointments. And the tech can really be useful in that regard if it is able to measure symptomatology remotely using short active assessments and provide that information back to the care team for them to make decisions on, hey, is this person taking their meds? Is this person actually getting better? If not, let's bring them back in. Let's change what the antipsychotic that they're on. Because right now, if there's a 2-month gap between 2 appointments, there isn't really any visibility into patient behavior. And for a patient with schizophrenia, a lot can happen in 2 months. Like if they have an episode, they lose their job, they're homeless, family leaves them, and all that is preventable only if the clinician was aware and was able to intervene in a timely manner. And so the tech is potential in pop health is really, really significant, and the business case is there as well, because the patients will cost less money if they are rehospitalized less. If they're on Medicare, Medicaid, the state will compensate the clinic more for better outcomes. So the case is there. It's actually just now a question of how and who is involved in integration of that tech. And of course, the sort of always looming question of like, how can this really be even regulated and scalable? I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I personally, it's the ultimate challenge of like how to integrate these technologies into, because healthcare is the one industry that has not been flipped upside down by tech just yet, and for good reason. They've got their processes, and data is treated very differently in healthcare as it is in other places. So it's a really difficult challenge.
And I want to come to Emmanuel's question because it's a really good one, but I have to react to what you said, Anzar, and my mind goes to, we started the conversation with the need to integrate a variety of these different measures in order to have a sort of truly sort of complete view of how the patient's getting on. You used a really compelling example, and what my mind went to is, this data no longer lives in sort of a manila folder in a locked file cabinet, and especially in the example you gave, and especially in mental health, the idea that that data may also be available to other sort of professionals, in addition to the physician, perhaps, making that available to sort of social workers who can support, the idea that it can flow to a full care team to really sort of deploy fit for purpose interventions as a response to that information flowing in is just, it's such a powerful future state, and one I certainly hope we can get to. Emmanuel, you asked a couple of really terrific questions here in the chat. Are you somewhere where you can unmute yourself and ask those directly?
Yes, so essentially, I know there was a lot of chatter between like the business side, and I'd really like to know if it would be feasible to give the patient the power to have their data and share with whom they please, because that might help with the trust barrier and maybe get a lot more adoption when it comes to patients, especially with this type of tech.
That's a really good question, Manuel. And my off-the-cuff sort of blunt answer to that is, of course, the patient should absolutely have the decision-making ability decision-making power to decide where their data is and goes and who's using it and how. So absolutely. I think in terms of how that affects the way insights can be derived from it is unclear. We don't know what this tech infrastructure looks like. Let me just paint like a very kind of like made up picture, right? Like, let's say that right now, my healthcare data, I go to Mount Sinai for my medical care. and they have electronic medical records that they've collected on me. And my Apple Health app on my iPhone is integrated and connected with the EMR system at Mount Sinai. So I can actually, they do share information with Apple and between Epic at Mount Sinai's EMR, so that I can view my lab results and other aspects of my health and things that were checked during my sort of physical in my iPhone. But another thing that's happening is that I wear an Apple Watch, and that also is connected to the same HealthKit platform. And so my heart rate and step counts and exercise behavior is going into that as well. If I use an app to track calories, those can integrate with HealthKit as well. So now there's this really, and now you can think of a multitude of tools that exist to try and put all of these different healthcare, sort of health-related data sets into a similar repository. And people have created companies and business models based off of, I'm going to be a provider of information to HealthKit within an iPhone or within the Apple's ecosystem. That's a lot of effort and time put into a single ecosystem. So now the patient has to decide, do I want to give my information to Apple? Of course, they should have the ability not to, but maybe if they decide not to, they're now at a disadvantage because they don't have that kind of tool that's accessible to them. There's maybe not going to be that many different options to pick from. You know, like, I don't use Google search, I use DuckDuckGo. Am I at a disadvantage sometimes? Absolutely. I sometimes go to Google when I want to check the weather because it doesn't have the nice tool that Google does to where it like lays out your weather for you. So, I mean, yeah, I think that they should have the choice. There's definitely going to be advantages and disadvantages associated with that.
Fantastic.
Thank you for that answer. That was really good.
Yeah, there are some companies actually that are coming to trying to converge those separate and siloed data, like patient data, into one. Sigster is one of them. I don't know if you've heard of them. So yeah, the patient can own the data, and then they can take it wherever they go, and so they can share and have the ability to share. So there's potential there to converge the data. And of course, there are also companies that are doing the linkages as well and matching from the different systems and siloed databases. So.
I agree with him, and I hope that that is the case. I was reading about them actually a couple of weeks ago. There's like a stat article on them. And I think it's a really fantastic idea. And I hope.
Yeah, I mean, it's emerging. It's not there. It's again, they have to show the value and the trust. And so the adoption is not there yet, but we're going there. So hopefully. And I don't know if there was also at one point talking about having, just like the Social Security number, everybody will have their sort of like, a patient number that will go with them. And so this way they can go, you can have your EMR for your data from say one provider. If you left them, then you can access that data. So, small strides.
Yeah.
Yeah, the patient-centered health record. I think I personally love to see us go that way. I think there's a lot of incentives currently for folks to keep, certainly some disincentives maybe is the way to think about it, to release data in that way. But I hope, Emmanuel, you brought up the most important focus here, right? Which is earning the trust of the patients and sort of delivering all of these mechanisms in a way that's most important to them. Valeria, you've had your hand up. Are you somewhere where you can unmute yourself and pose your question?
Hi, yes, I am. Thanks for such an interesting discussion. I was kind of invited last minute, and I'm really glad I could make it. I hear you all talking a lot about being able to sort of predict depression and obviously using it within the sort of clinical setting. But one of the things that I'm never too sure about is like how, where are we at the stage of being able to define what is kind of wellness and what is illness, right? Because at the moment, what we've got is a set of, obviously sort of clinician diagnostic manuals, but also we've got kind of arbitrary cutoff points in specific scales that we use to kind of measure symptoms. So how, in what way are these technologies going to help us move forward? So like kind of overcome these barriers of having a kind of arbitrary cutoff of saying, well, if you have these many steps, then that means that, you know, you're well or you're ill, or, you know, how do we kind of move that barrier across basically with these technologies?
That's a really, really good question. Thank you for bringing it up. I think that, you know, I'm not a depression researcher, so ultimately, I don't know the answer to those questions, but I can comment on how digital phenotyping can be helpful in those efforts and endeavors, right? Like right now there's, you know, who knows how many different types of ways to be depressed. And the tools that we rely on are the HAM-D or the MADRS or the PHQ-9. And those are thoughtfully and carefully constructed to be able to measure different aspects of the disorder, but certainly they don't have the level of nuance to be able to classify individual kinds of subtypes of the disorder. And when we come up with a lot of different measurement tools, we now have a little bit more power to build better classification algorithms to try and develop, identify different subtypes of the disease in patient populations. And when we think about how that can be used in the context of just drug development, we can now understand, oh, if this person has this set of symptomatologies as measured by the tools, they'll respond to this kind of treatment. And if they're part of this subset of sort of groups or cluster of symptoms, they may respond to that kind of treatment. And that can be very useful in terms of adding a little bit more nuance to the decision making of what kind of treatment to provide. The other question I think was yours on, like, what are the factors? You know, we're predicting it, but what is it that we're predicting and how are we using that? I don't know. And I think that is context dependent. So when we were trying to sort of build that project for schizophrenia, we were not trying to predict schizophrenia severity, or we were not trying to predict how sick the person was going to be at any given point. We were actually trying to predict something that was a lot more tangible and practical, which was like, are they going to go for rehospitalization sometime in the next few months? Are they going to have an emergency room visit in the next one? And if we can predict that, that's also really valuable insight for the care team to be able to intervene proactively. So, you know, if we can make predictions on that kind of stuff in the context of, I don't know, insurance companies who want to know, identify members that are maybe at higher risk and then provide them with preventative care, let's say for cardiovascular disease. You know, then maybe that kind of prediction is really helpful for them to be able to alleviate costs, which they care about ultimately, and is a driving factor for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you know, that does make a lot of sense, and it does mean that we are using sort of different outcome measures. Obviously, hospitalization might be a bit of a kind of very dramatic outcome measure. Hopefully, we'll have ones that are a little bit kind of closer within the continuum of wellness. But I guess, you know, using different outcome measures means that we can get rid of the sort of gold standards that we're using to compare some of these kind of passive features to. So, for example, if all we're doing is comparing kind of data streams to the traditional, I say, PHQ-9 or MADRS or whatever scale you use, you kind of, you know, these new technologies, they can be great at filling in lots of the holes in between in terms of the time scale, but at the same time, you're never gonna move past the issues that come with using these scales. I guess, as you say, which is something that in depression research is something that we're kind of being increasingly mindful of. So if you're using sort of, I guess these technologies can help you come up with other outcome measures that essentially can help you get rid of previous or more traditional sort of scales, I guess.
I agree, and there's a level of sort of deeper dive into the neuroscience and neurology of it that I don't get to do, but I think there's necessarily a need for. You know, like if I'm able to measure blunted affect in a patient's schizophrenia, or even depression, if I'm able to measure sort of reduced facial expressivity, which we know is in one way or the other quantified in a clinician assessment or scale, what is that an underlying representation of neurologically speaking? Like what in the serotonergic pathways is leading to that? Could we make the connections from the pathway and the neurotransmitter disruptions to the symptoms, and have that be the evaluation metric rather than this sort of cloud of depression classification that we've built? And can we move to a place where the treatments are also then defined according to that understanding? Or this drug's going to affect this pathway, which is where this symptom's coming from. Maybe I can think about assigning treatment in that manner rather than thinking this person's depressed, these are my list of SSRIs, SNRIs, let me just throw them on there and see which one works. I say this, by the way, having no clinical experience, so like, please take this all with a grain of salt. But that's as far as my understanding goes. You know, it would be nice to have more direct lines between understanding the specific pathways that individual symptoms are manifesting from and which treatments will directly affect those versus others.
Sure, yeah, more targeted treatments, basically. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks.
Valerie, a terrific question, and what a great discussion ensued. Thank you so much. We've got a couple of other questions I want to make sure we get to. So Supriya, let's come to you first. You put a really interesting article in the chat, and then you posed a question. Are you somewhere you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly?
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. I'll be brief as possible. I'm currently working on a variety of projects regarding digital health, and one in particular is how, using my computer science and economics background, how bias is introduced in various algorithms and analytics, and that has caused health disparities and so on. I will post another link from AHRQ, the federal agency, as a follow-up for later read. The issue really is that a lot of the algorithms and analytics are now being seen as a source of disparities, and it is not being adequately addressed. And this will be more so in digital health, and you know, when there's volumes of data being collected, and we need not just to master the data elements, but also the processing of data, what we call data ops, and the process itself. So I was wondering what Dr. Abbas has, if Dr. Abbas has some thoughts about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing up that question, Priyo. You know, the question around bias in algorithm development is very real and incredibly concerning. And I think that it's something that we should all have sort of in the front of our minds as we're developing this tech, and think of the ways in which we can address it. Similar to last week's journal club discussion, or last month's journal club discussion, where the presenter or the author was talking about sort of disparities in access to technology and how that can affect. I just don't think about that. I hadn't thought about it as actively as I should have been while developing the tech. And I think, you know, bias in these algorithms is a similar example where we just need to be, it needs to be in the front of our minds as we're developing this tech. Because in certain cases, it can manifest in ways that are even right now addressable. For example, the tech that we developed at AICure measures facial behavior, for example, in clinical trials and clinical research. It looks at, in one example, how blunted affect may change in a person with schizophrenia over the course of treatment, or how emotional expressivity may change in a depressed person over the course of a treatment. Now, there are underlying biases in facial recognition and classification algorithms for landmarks. It works better on some people than others. The values may be skewed on some people versus others. But we try to be aware of that and recognize that and think about how is it that we can address this problem. The realization that we came to, and the reason we were a little bit more at ease with that sort of involvement of bias there, was we're looking at intra-individual change over time. So even if there is individual to individual differences because of skewness in the predictions of the algorithms, that actually ultimately doesn't affect the repeated measures ANOVA I'm going to run at the end of this study. And so in that aspect, it's not playing a big role in causing sort of discrepancies in the data that we're capturing. And we can be intentional to use the data only in that way and not to try to make larger judgments on this is what facial expressivity looks like on a depressed person, this is what it looks like on a healthy person. We don't make that kind of judgment or claim, because we know that we just can't with the data set that we have because of the limitations of the biases of the algorithms. Not to mention that emotional expressivity can be very different cultures, people's backgrounds, on top of the algorithms themselves maybe not working as well in white people versus brown people versus black people. So it's important to just have always in front of our minds. I'm not somebody who actively works on, I'm not a machine learning engineer, and I'm not working on the development of the algorithms and trying to make them sort of more universally applicable. But we do take great care in terms of the tools that we should all take great care in terms of the tools that we use, that we understand the data sets they were trained on, how widely applicable they are, and anyone that's developing those tools should be reporting that kind of stuff as well.
Supriya, what a tremendous question, and Anzar, what a thoughtful answer. And I'm glad you mentioned our last journal club where we were talking about this concept of sort of digital sort of inclusivity. And one of the things that Rachel and I actually have been talking about since then sort of applies to this conversation, which is this concept of, you know, promoting inclusivity by design. In the same way we've powerfully used quality by design, privacy by design principles, you know, how can our community, and maybe even something Dime can do, you know, really put together a toolkit to support, you know, everyone thinking about it all the time? Because Anzar, you hit the nail on the head. It's, you know, sometimes we need to be reminded of that, and how can we really sort of infuse this idea of inclusivity by design into everything we do. And Supriya, what we'll do is there's some fantastic links in the chat, everyone. This has been a tremendous conversation. Supriya, yesterday there was a public meeting hosted by FDA that touched on some of these issues, and they had a patient and family advisory council meeting towards the tail end of last year that's sort of addressed this too. What we'll do before we post the slides, we'll grab the links from the chat, we'll add those FDA links, and that's what we'll post to the website when they go live, likely sometime tomorrow. And with that, Anzar, what a tremendous conversation. Congratulations on a terrific paper. I hadn't realized that Friday was your last day at AI Cure. Congratulations, and excited to hear what next steps look like for you and how you'll continue pushing the field. Everyone on the line, this was an absolutely tremendous discussion, such important topics. I think, you know, the key takeaway here is the need to be looking across a variety of different collaborators within our own organizations, across different measures and at various levels of the sort of tech and implementation stack to make sure we're doing the best with these tools for our patients. In the 1 minute we have left before we break, and I thank Anzar again, I just want to quickly run through a couple of upcoming events here at Dime that might pique your interest. Our next virtual journal club is happening on May 26th. It's not in progress, it's done, but we have a whole body of work. Sumal, for example, I know you've been working on this. Our evidence checklist will be published very shortly. We will be doing a public meeting on that on May 26th, and I hope that many of you can join us. In addition, our webinar next week is thinking about digital medicine and the future for pharmacists. I hope that these events might pique your interest, and Anzar, most importantly, what a tremendous discussion today. Thank you for being with us, especially from vacation in Mexico, above and beyond, and we really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And I put my email in the chat, so please, you know, reach out if anybody wants to continue talking or has something that they want to discuss. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.